Hey, it's Patrick here again, and on this episode of Philosophy Sundays, I'd like to briefly talk about ontology. So, ontology is essentially the study of being. Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, dedicated his life to studying ontology, and how he did this was through asking a question and repeatedly asking this question throughout his life. And this question is, what is being? Or even simply, what is? For Heidegger, this question of being finds its root within figuring out one's own being. So, in other words, to access being in general, we have to first understand our own being. To start this process of figuring out one's own being, Heidegger talks about something called a person's average everydayness. What this average everydayness is essentially what a person is firstly and most often. I guess it's kind of, what a person is on an average day. There are three questions that Heidegger uses to figure out one's own average everydayness, and I highly suggest that anyone who is on the path of figuring oneself out, that they should really ponder on these questions whenever they have the time. The first question is, what is the pleasure that preoccupies you firstly and most often? The second is, what is the emotion that you feel firstly and most often? And finally, the third is, what is the activity that preoccupies you firstly and most often? In my opinion, I think these questions are just trying to figure out that on an average day, what is the thing that you find pleasure in? What kind of makes you happy on an average day? How do you feel? What emotions do you feel on an average day? And what activity do you find yourself doing most often on your average day? For Heidegger, by starting at this point of figuring oneself out, figuring one's own being out, then one will have access or a better understanding of being in general. Jean-Paul Sartre also studied ontology, and he's heavily influenced by Heidegger. And then Heidegger himself studied phenomenology and ontology under Edmund Husserl. So a lot of these ideas can be traced back to Husserl. And in his book, What is Metaphysics, he talks about how there are four parts to being. And these four parts are, if I remember properly, it's thinking, doing, becoming, and appearing. So essentially what I believe Husserl is talking about in his book, What is Metaphysics, is that a person's being is linked to these four things. So the first level is that of thinking. Whatever I think I am, I can be. This isn't always the case, since a person can think they are one way, but actually be a different way. An example of this would be someone who believes they're really good at, let's say, soccer, but in reality, they're terrible. The next level to this is doing. So by doing something, this would essentially mean that we are this. So again, bringing back to our example of an athlete, by playing sports or by doing sports, one would be considered an athletic person. Even higher, the next level of this is that of either becoming or appearing. I'm honestly not too sure which came first in Husserl's book, What is Metaphysics? But I guess I'll start with appearing, just because in my mind it's easier to explain. Whatever a person appears to be is linked to what they actually are. So again, an example of this would be someone who appears to be very athletic, very muscular shape, but this does not necessarily mean that they are athletic. Some people are just born with the great genes of being able to easily build muscle. Doesn't mean they train just as hard as an athlete. Finally, it's the last level is that of becoming. So this is where I have a lot more difficulty understanding what Husserl actually means by the link between being and becoming. But there's a song by Larry A. Just that has a really interesting line that really stuck to me while I was reading What is Metaphysics, and it translates directly to everything that I will ever be, I already was. I think what it's trying to point to here that is linked to Husserl's What is Metaphysics and the link between being and becoming is that whatever we become or are going to become, we already were in the beginning. It was always there. We just had to go through the process to become that which we already were. For personal experiences, I can kind of not explain but talk about is, since I am studying in education and I'm on the road to becoming a teacher, I had a close friend tell me a couple weeks ago that I was always already the teacher ever since we were kids. And at first it didn't make sense to me, but now that I'm approaching going into my student practicum, I guess I'm starting to think and feel more this feeling that I've always kind of knew I was going to go into this profession, but at the same time, it's going to be a lifelong process for me to become this. So I guess there's this weird paradox between what we are, what we've always been, and what we will become. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in phenomenology, existentialism, or ontology to really read What is Metaphysics by Edmund Husserl. It's a fairly short book. I believe you can probably read it in a sitting if you really wanted to again. Heidegger's book, Being in Time, is a lot longer. I do have notes on these books, or on Being in Time, in my blog if you haven't checked it out. Guess I'll put a link in the description later on. But that's all I got for today. So I guess to recap it all, it's really my challenge for you guys this week is to just ask yourself those 3 average everydayness questions, and even repeatedly ask Heidegger's main ontological question, which is, what is being? And those 3 average everydayness questions would be, what is the pleasure that preoccupies me firstly and most often? What is the emotion that I feel firstly and most often? And finally, what is the activity that preoccupies me firstly and most often? So thanks for listening and have a great Sunday. I'll catch you again next week. Bye.